Now, this morning we're talking about boundaries. They are an essential part of a healthy relationship. It's going to be really challenging at the moment, and it's a real skill anyway. But first of all, I think, Lee, is it about knowing your limits, first of all, and understanding what you can tolerate and what causes stress and or makes you feel uncomfortable? Because as soon as you feel stressed or feel uncomfortable, then that's a key that the other person is crossing a boundary.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so if we sort of establish personal boundaries, I would say for me, and I'll be really interested to hear what you guys think, are the limits and rules
Yeah,
we set for ourselves within the different
yeah,
relationships and aspects of our lives. So it's when we can say no to something or someone or a situation and have a sense of sort of self-respect and know that our values and what we feel is right for us is as valuable as how we are perceived by the other person. Because there can be knowing our limits, as
yeah,
you quite rightly say,
true.
Lise, but then there can be setting the
Yeah,
limit, the different challenge, right? And
yeah,
really, often not having very strong boundaries, certainly my experience when I was younger, was very much to do with I
mm,
didn't really know what they were. Because
no,
unless you've grown up in an environment where you've been surrounded by people who have healthy boundaries, and maybe your primary caregivers have respected your boundaries and taught you what healthy boundaries are, they might be a bit wobbly. So there
yeah,
might be some areas where you kind of think, actually, that's an area where I don't understand what my boundaries are. So I think
right,
that it's really knowing your limits, as you say, and knowing
yeah,
what your values are. Because when you know what your values are, what's truly important to you, that can be a great indicator of knowing where to set the limits. And sometimes, if you really can't think of what your limits are, think, well, what would be too much for me? When would I know someone had really crossed the line with me? And kind of work your way back from that. Does that make sense, people?
yeah. So it's really important, first of all, to work out your limits, basically.
Totally. So you'd understand where your boundaries lie. So you say things like, well, how
Yeah,
much is too far for me? How
hmm,
much am I willing to take? We can all be tolerant up to a point, but then when is it too much for you? How do you know when someone's crossing the line? And what can be really helpful is as I've said on other lives, list it down, because it's
yeah,
kind of like when you can think about it in a concrete way, what
hmm,
is and isn't acceptable, then it starts to give you a framework to work towards. Does this make
yeah,
sense? And I think the great thing is when you have clear boundaries and you can start practicing putting them into place, then it really helps actually develop the relationships with other people in your life, for them to understand what doorways, if you like, they can enter through and what's okay with you and what's not. So they
yeah,
have a much clearer idea. And I don't know
yeah,
if this is familiar with anybody, but have you ever found someone asking you to do something, and because we might perceive ourselves to be incredibly kind or understanding or whatever, we can't understand why someone else can't figure out that that is not a reasonable thing to ask us? Does anyone relate to this? And so
yeah,
you
absolutely.
can end up saying yes to a boundary, and then all of a sudden resent the other person. Think, why the bloody hell did they ask me that? They should have known that was a ridiculous thing to ask. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I don't know. I've done that in the past myself. But the thing is, people aren't mind readers, and people can
Yeah,
be really excellent in all other areas. But sometimes we have to be very clear, and we can do this in a clear, but there can be no ambiguity about it. Someone was saying yes a lot. Yeah. So you can all relate to that one.
yeah,
So we've got to be really, clear and concise. And we can do this with the tone of voice we use, with just being very clear and not necessarily having to explain in great detail why we're making the decision that we are. Because have you ever done this, anyone, where you start to say no to something and you give a whole story around why you're saying no? Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
That relates to me. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of tea. My throat's croaky. Mm.
yeah. I find it really difficult actually setting boundaries. I really do. It's yeah, like you said, you say yes to something and then you resent them, or you feel guilty, or I just constantly feel guilty about not doing stuff for people, or I find it really difficult setting boundaries.
So here's the thing. Once you
Yeah,
realize what your limits are and you've written it down, there's a couple of things
yeah,
I want to throw in here for those times when we find it difficult to set boundaries, because you probably all
hmm,
relate to it at times. We did touch on this in another live, and I'll be really interested to see what you think around it in this context. Things like kindness, forgiveness, being a good person are all qualities that we talk about, and we all talk, you see it on social media, be kind, be forgiving, be positive, and all of these things are great things to nurture. However, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, right? And there is that point where we spoke about another life where you can be so forgiving of someone else's behavior and requests that you fail to give them an opportunity to learn maybe that is not okay behavior and grow in their own way.
Absolutely, yeah. We've spoken about that before, yeah.
And there can be times when, you know, we can be kind, but if you are kind without any boundary, then you are potentially open if someone comes along and wants to take too much. But when is that point where someone's actually taking you for a ride, or you bumped into a con man or a con person? Do you know what I mean? A con woman. Does this make sense? So, and the other aspect is we all like to, or most of us like to think of ourselves as sort of honourable human beings, right? It's human nature to sort of amp up the good stuff that we do. But in terms of being honest, if we are setting boundaries and letting someone know about what our boundaries are, we are actually being more honest with them.
Absolutely.
You know, and honest about what the relationship is and what we need. And this, you know, really sort of looks at the bigger picture of the relationship and how it's going to relationship evolves. But it sets the bar for how the other person can then behave. And it also nurtures not only a self-respect, but respect from others. Because have you ever found people in your social circle, Lise, you just think, no, you know exactly where you stand with them. You think, no, I wouldn't try that on with that. I wouldn't ask that person that, or I know where my line is with that person. You know? And they can be really lovely and really, you know, wonderful. But you know where the line is.
What if you're scared about the other person's response?
Yes. So here's the thing: there are certain people you might set a boundary with, and there could be an expectation of how we would like them to behave. But I think this is where, when it comes to boundaries, we have to really drop the expectation. The person may well not behave in a way that we would like them to behave, and thinking that if I set this boundary, then therefore that means the other person will behave in a certain way, and they won't necessarily. But we have to be, it's like keeping our side of the street clean of what's most important to me, and how can my behavior, my reaction to something be different to help me expand my life and boundary setting. So, you know, there are going to be people in our lives who we will set a boundary with, and they will push back. And there can be, go on.
So if you're living with somebody right now and you need to set the boundaries, how would you do it in a practical way? I mean, can you write them a letter if they're not able, you know, you're able to communicate properly?
I would alert the person that I would like to speak to them and say, I'd like to talk to you if you can create some space. And if they push you back, then I would say something like, okay, well, let me just quickly tell you now then, right? And then already you're asserting yourself in that situation. And then state very clearly what your problem is, what your issue is, what your grievance is. You know, I feel when you do this, XXX, right? And it may, you know, it's stating, you're not pointing the finger saying, you know, you're behaving like a bleep, bleep, bleep. You're saying, when you do this, I feel this, right? And then you can almost sort of explain the benefits of if things start to shift, or when things start to shift, that how much better the communication can be between the two of you. You know, that they will get more of what they want in a way, and what you will be able to do in return. So you're almost sort of selling in the benefits a bit, and you can agree and what would be a great time to start this. How will you both know things are being done differently, and chat it through and agree how each person can behave. Now, not everyone is going to go for that, right?
No,
and the thing is, sometimes we're going to have to let people go, and we're going to have to close the door on some relationships if they will not understand where the boundary lies. Or it might be that you have to put a boundary around the kind of time or you spend around them. Or if it's, say, a family member and they're constantly intrusive, then it might be that you set a limit to only talking for 10 minutes on the phone, and there's certain subjects that you won't discuss. And there is something around when you say something 3 times to somebody. If someone is saying, really pushing on something, and you state 3 times, no, that doesn't work for me. No, that doesn't work for me. No, thank you. This and that. Then you're not giving them any story around or why you're saying no. You're making it very concise. And when you keep batting it back at them, they will eventually, research shows in most cases, that they will pull back. This is more almost sort of in work environments. It's sort of like the rule of three, if you like. You just keep saying no. This is not always comfortable. Right.
I know, I was going to say, it's really difficult. You have to have a lot of courage, I think, to...
Well, yeah. And I think the thing is, Lisa, is it's breaking it down into, again, small bite-sized actions you can take. So, it might be you want to change a lot in a boundary setting within a relationship or context, whether it's at work, with a personal relationship, a professional one, a community one, whatever it might be. But you start off with a small one that seems more manageable, and just test it out. And you're almost sort of dipping your toe in. And the thing is, with any behavior change, right, there is going to be a period of tolerating the uncertainty of how that feels. And that is a gateway to change. And I think if we can see tolerating the uncertainty as the gateway to
once
change.
You've set the boundaries as well, it's really important to keep that. Otherwise, if you're going backwards and forwards through the boundaries, then the other person gets confused.
Yeah, it's definitely, the consistency part is really important.
Yeah.
But it's also, as the relationship changes, being open to doing things differently. But I know certainly where I have stumbled is I set boundaries, for instance, in a family relationship a while back. And then as the boundaries were set, then I let them down slightly, because I kind of got into this sort of sense of false security, if you like. And the minute the boundary went down, the old behavior started. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely,
because I almost kind of forgot that those boundaries had to keep being set. And I suddenly got a wake-up call thinking, oh, hang on a minute, I need to reinstate those and say, actually, I can give you a little bit more, but I'm not going back into that same arena with you. And I just sort of then bring them back down and say,
so you have to keep reminding people all the time.
Also yourself.
Those boundaries. And yourself.
Yourself. So because, they're your boundaries and what's important to you. So it's sort of being mindful that, we can be getting relaxed around and think, oh, that worked, and then forget and end up oversharing about something or opening the gateway to more information. This person runs with it, just starts telling us what to do again. So I think that would be my
and also it's about giving yourself permission to set boundaries.
Totally. Because it's self-respect. It's about, knowing that our sense of value and worthiness and what's important to us is of value, and people need to know this, and this helps all our relationships thrive. And it's, sometimes we have to relearn these things. And God, I tell you, people, I'm, in my mid-50s, and I came to all of this stuff very late in life because I didn't really understand what they were half the time.
Yeah, so, me too.
You have to, we never stop learning, and that's the great thing, right? We'll always learn more and evolve.
I really like thinking about self-care as well, making self-care a priority, because it gives yourself permission to put yourself first.
The thing is, Lisa, right, we have a culture in society where it's like, work more, achieve more, be busier, keep going, get 4 hours sleep, all this kind of thing, which is changing, thank goodness. But, this sort of, we're talking about self-care, and we're talking about mental health and well-being. This is the same as anything. Like, going to the gym, if you stop going, you lose muscle tone. If you stop putting your self-care plans in place, we become mentally more vulnerable and emotionally more vulnerable to the different challenges. If our body is in deficit in terms of we're not sleeping, eating, getting enough exercise, having enough connection with friends, all these emotional needs we've spoken about in other morning tea times, then we are more vulnerable to other things that happen in life, the challenges that inevitably happen. This is part of the human experience. So the self-care is an absolute must. It's a non-negotiable, and this will, obviously, depending on what we're going through, we have to be flexible with it, how we do it. But it's really important. It's the foundation of everything else that we do. you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-care and self-love. Well, thank you so
Trust
much
these
for that,
people.
Lee. That's so useful and really helpful.